I'm now joined by Kurt Hackbarth, who wrote an article for Jacobin. AMLO's Morena wins Mexican midterms, where he says, facing an alliance of right-wing parties, business associations, and U.S.-backed institutions like the National Endowment for Democracy, AMLO's Morena party still managed to retain its majority in Congress. It is a victory worth celebrating. So we're going to talk about that. How are you doing, Kurt?
Good. Thanks, Ben, for having me on.
Yeah. So let's do. People watching this, listening to this, might have caught us talking about some of this stuff last year on Jacobin's YouTube channel. But right. For anybody who missed that, let's just take a minute and talk a little bit about the background, because this is the fact that this party Morena is in power at all is pretty remarkable given Mexican history before very recently.
Yeah, it is. Well, we can go back a little bit and talk about some of the history. Morena wins the presidency in 2018 with Andrés Manuel López Obrador on its first presidential outing. I think the first thing to recall is how young a party Morena is. Morena was only founded in 2014, and it 4 years later it won the presidency and is now out kind of defending its majority. So that in itself is remarkable in the history of Mexican politics and not only. But the victory in 2018 is the result of a long movement. The people who founded Morena have been in this movement for many years. This was actually AMLO's third presidential run. He first ran for president in 2006 in an election that was almost certainly an electoral fraud. He ran again in 2012 against Enrique Peña Nieto in an election which was marred by all kinds of vote buying and dirty money coming in from Odebrecht, the Brazilian company, which scandal has toppled presidents all across South America. So it's quite a remarkable story that he gets knocked down in 2006. Gets back up, get knocked down in 2012, gets back up, and this movement left the former center-left party, which was the PRD, and did what I think is the dream of a lot of American leftists and formed a new party, and didn't stay within this rotting husk of the PRD. Now, they're helped by the fact that Mexico has public financing of campaigns, otherwise it wouldn't have been possible. But the fact that they were able to do this and win again this year, and we can talk about that, in the face of the pandemic and the fact that the economy went down 8.8% last year because of pandemic-related things, a united alliance of parties against them, U.S. financing, a wall of media, both national and international, and they held their majority. And not only that, they did very well in governor's races and in legislatures and in mayorships. And from north to south, which is interesting because Mexico has a very big north-south divide. And Morena showed in this and these midterms that they could win pretty much anywhere in the country.
Yeah, you said in the article that they had won like everywhere from the sort of industrial border regions, by the U.S. To the much more indigenous and rural southern areas, which is part of what makes this victory remarkable. And I think anybody who's seen coverage of it in the American press, it's all like the emphasis is always like, oh, this is a really narrow victory, or the maintain a narrow lead. It's sort of put in making it sound like it's like almost right. Bad news. But I do want to, before getting into the particulars of this election, I do want to talk a little bit more about what Morena is and what it stands for. So you said it originated in a split from this sort of established center-left party, the PRD. So what distinguished it politically, from its sort of from the PRD?
The PRD was founded in 1988, which was a combination of a breakaway segment from the Revolutionary Industrial Party, the former hegemonic party of state, the PRI, There was a movement in the 80s to attempt to democratize the PRI from within, which failed. That was doomed to failure. So a segment of the PRI left to form the PRD and agglutinated a lot of smaller left-wing parties, including Mexico's socialist parties, into this broad umbrella of the PRD. And they won the 1980 election with Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas, and that was, again, one of the big electoral frauds of the 20th century. The PRD, it was always a very uneasy coexistence. Kind of what they talked about was the tribes within the PRD, because there were former members of the PRI, the former hegemonic party, there were smaller socialist parties. It was always an uneasy coexistence that between the different sectors of the party. They never managed to balance it completely.
Right.
When 2006 came around and AMLO had his first presidential run, after that, there was, AMLO contested the election. He refused to accept the results. He didn't pull an Al Gore. He said, this was a fraud and I'm not buying it. Declared himself even the legitimate president at the time and had an alternative oath of office. The PRD went through a real shakedown, and they had internal elections, and it was a mess. And basically, the more conservative faction within the PRD took control of the party, began to set the agenda in the party, and it created a lot of, a schism. AMLO ran again on the PRD ticket in 2012, but he was already 1 foot out the door. And as soon as that election was over, he founded Morena. And what does Morena stand for? Morena is a big tent party. So you'll find something of everything in there. Anything from liberals to socialists. In general, it's a center-left party. It's, there are some good things in Morena, and there are some things that definitely need to be criticized within it. One thing about it is, it's as a young party, it still doesn't have a very clear mechanism for choosing candidacies. So, and that's everything in a party. Who chooses the candidates? There's no primary system. Candidates are chosen on the basis of either what the party president wants or kind of elect opinion polls, which is not the best way to choose candidates. So it's very irregular is what I'm going at. So you've had some very good candidates with a real commitment to social justice and social democracy in Morena. And then you've also had some terrible candidates which have nothing to do with the left whatsoever. So it's a very modeled party in that sense. And that's something Morena is going to need to solve going into the next presidential election in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, so the fact that, they were elected in 2018, and like you said, this is a broad coalition, within the party. And they're also operating within some severe constraints. I mean, that they've got, they have to, any attempt to implement any kind of social democratic program, in Mexico is happening in the context of, the 800-pound gorilla, next door that you have to, maintain, good relations with. So what are the things that AMLO and Morena, were able to do, between, 2018 and this year that, in terms of implementing positive reforms?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty solid, social democratic center-left platform in the sense of what are we looking at? We're looking at scholarships for students, stay-in-school scholarships, a series of cash transfer programs to the poorer classes, apprenticeships for non-students, a universal pension for seniors, a 65 and over pension, which is actually set to increase. AMLO has always had a very particular focus on senior citizens, and he started the first ever pension in Mexico City as the mayor as of 2000. Small business help, benefits for the disabled, unemployment insurance. These things didn't exist in Mexico before, or sometimes they were kind of token programs that were kind of usually ways to co-opt certain constituencies. And what he's done in a lot of these cases is raise these to the level of a constitutional right. in a bunch of these cases. For example, the scholarships and the pension, in other words. So they would be much harder to roll back in case that were to, conservative majority to come in later. Help for farmers, price supports, a basic package of foodstuffs. AMLO's big push is to make Mexico sovereign again, both in energy and food. So help to farmers, which, the countryside was devastated by NAFTA, which, big push for immigration, trying to get Mexico to be self-sufficient again instead of importing most of its food or much of its food from the United States. A big push in energy to try to make Mexico self-sufficient in energy again. We saw in February when the lights went out in Texas, the lights went out for 4 million people in Texas, in Mexico as well. So you've got a country that's an oil-producing country that, through years of bleeding and neoliberal counter reforms, Mexico's become dependent on United States refining its oil and selling it back as gasoline. So that's been a big push, and that's gotten the most pushback on the international level. Minimum wage increase of 60%. It's still far too low, but it's a lot better than it was. Stable peso, a public option for banking, which is what's called the Bank of Well-Being, which is an attempt to establish a public option in the face of a cartelized banking system where about 6 international banks run the whole show here and bleed people dry, as in the States, with commissions, with fees, with overdraft charges, and anything you can imagine. Marijuana legalization, that was a Supreme Court mandate, but they did go ahead and pass that, and they'll also set to free federal prisoners for nonviolent drug offenses. Also, an amnesty law for women who had abortions and were jailed, indigenous prisoners and such. Getting corporations to pay back taxes that they weren't paying before. And I think a big thing also is a ban on genetically modified corn and glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, in Monsanto's Roundup. And that's also got a big pushback. Mexico is the civilization that gave corn to the world, and it's been prey to GMO corn coming in and this toxic chemical glyphosate, which even the United Nations said is probably a cancer, causes cancer. And that's been a big thing. Warning labels on processed foods didn't exist here before that. Mexico has a huge obesity problem, second, I think, in the world, also as a result of processed foods flooding in post-NAFTA. Secret ballot for union elections, a rolling back of outsourcing. So companies now can only do outsourcing for non-essential company functions, and outsourced companies are on a national registry. So you can't just outsource your entire company and have a shell company. That's just going into effect now. And actually, Mary Kay Cosmetics just filed an injunction against that, so they can continue to exploit their workers down here. So anybody who's watching and uses Mary Kay, maybe we could think about boycotting them. Public housing benefit has been reformed to help people who are underwater with mortgages with public housing. Commissions on pensions have been rolled back. So that's kind of in the social and the domestic side. So I think it's a defendable social democratic program. Right?
Yeah, that's a really impressive list of achievements. Especially public banking, having put in the protections, pensions for seniors, scholarships for low-income students, making constitutional guarantees, of those.
Right.
Like those are, I think, in almost any context, those would be really big, advances. But especially in Mexico, given the, given the starting point, those
right.
are, those are really remarkable achievements, and I think that's probably important, to keep in mind, because I think some American leftists maybe when they first hear it's like, okay, it's a center left party, it's a big tent within the party, and they've had to make coalitions, deals outside of it, forces that aren't so good, and they have, and even within it, some people are maybe liberals, maybe not even, and they might, hear all that and go, okay, so, what is there to get excited about here? But I mean, that program you just rattled off for like 5 minutes. I mean, that is, I mean, you're not going to get, even if Morena, was a very different kind of party. I mean, like, you're not going to be governing this, country, bordering the United States and very much under its eye, and have like, workers control the means of production or something. That's not going to be that's not going to be in the cards. But I mean, that kind of, I mean, look at the history of American intervention in Latin America for
of course.
Over nothing, over like extremely incremental, reforms.
Over much less than this in a lot of instances.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Over much less than this, and this is a really remarkable. And so, I mean, this is a really remarkable series of accomplishments over the course of 3 years, especially over the course of 3 years that included a year, a year, more than a year of the COVID pandemic. And the economic, ripple effects of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, that's very important to point out. I think this is where some of the analysis north of the border, all across the spectrum, is simply leaving something out, right? Because you get, articles anywhere from the Economist to the Nation, basically saying, AMLO has been a disappointment to, the galaxy. So why did Morena do so well in the midterms? Why can, it's like, what's missing here that would point out that AMLO retained his majority during a pandemic, won 11 out of 15 governorships, and 19 out of 30 state legislatures. 5 of them, they won every single seat in those legislatures. Morena is not perfect, I'll be the first to say it. But, in the middle of a pandemic that has toppled, it toppled Trump, it toppled people all over the world. Governing parties have gotten hit everywhere on this. What's missing in these analyses that, doesn't lead us to see what happened in these midterms? Now, that's, I think, a very important point, because, if you're kind of reporting based on ideology and not what's really happening on the ground, something's being left out here, right? And I think another thing to point out is that in foreign affairs, Mexico has again started taking more of a lead role in Latin America than it used to. Remember, it sent a plane to save Evo Morales from Bolivia. It's bucked the Organization of American States, which is a US tool in a lot of cases. It called out the United Nations for not releasing the patents on COVID vaccines. When, the United States and Europe were very slow on vaccines, it made deals with Russia and China. So now, Mexico is, I think, 9th in the world in the number of vaccines administered. It put a brake on the operations of the DEA down here under AMLO. The DEA basically had carte blanche to, run around here with diplomatic immunity, with guns, all kinds of wayward operations. And now there's a brake been put on that as well. So you see an administration
no 2021 Mexican season of Narcos.
Yes. You see an administration with the compromises that it's had to make, and it's made some unsavory ones, for example, on migration. You finally see a government that is putting its own country first. It's putting its own country first, Mexican sovereignty, and then he's hit on that because he's a throwback to the 70s, because, sovereignty isn't cool anymore. It's either this kind of, on one hand, you throw up your hands and accept the savage globalization, or on one other hand, this kind of ecumenical, we're all one kind of thing without realizing the geopolitics involved. And, Mexico is now looking out for its own sovereignty and a lot of things, and all of a sudden that's a throwback to, an outdated kind of nationalism. There's a problem in these analyses that I think they're leaving some stuff out.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, I think this is really significant. I mean, the bucking, kind of standing up to the empire, essentially with the plane to get Morales. Like, I mean, I think symbolically, I mean, that's huge, and I mean, all of these moves, I mean, like, do signify a not perfect, probably, especially with some of those migration decisions that you mentioned, which I think are at least partially a matter of pressure, from the United States, these are significant gestures of independence.
Agreed. And it's interesting that AMLO sees a lot through the lens of Mexican sovereignty, however outdated a concept sovereignty may be, right? And that, in its way, is a threat to the United States. Any country that wants to put first its own resources for its own population, that is not to the liking of the great powers anywhere. So I think even both the pros and the cons of AMLO, you can see it through his real concern for sovereignty, right? So he's also been very fiscally careful, very, very, nearly orthodox in his managing of budgetary affairs. And that's been criticized, and rightly so. But, I think we have to realize that AMLO grew up, first of all, the coup against Allende when he was a freshman in college. So the whole concern of his generation is, how do you have a center-left government that stays in power? And then in '82, as a young politician, the debt crisis here, where Mexico, the peso collapsed, oil prices collapsed, Mexico was overly dependent on oil production, and opened itself up to an international humiliation. So his whole thing is avoiding international humiliations, at all costs, and maintaining the nation's sovereignty at all costs. So that's been an important underlying factor for a lot of his decision making. So you see a president who doesn't wing around the world. He's trying to sell off Mexico's equivalent of Air Force One. He never travels. He's in Mexico. His concern is Mexico. He doesn't go off to big summits. The former president, Enrique Peña Nieto, from the PRI, would go winging off everywhere, on these vast junkets. He had a state visit with the Queen, and they had hundreds of people and dignitaries and this lavish dinners and all this in a country where half of the population is below the international poverty line, 50 million people. And, a lot of people are living on a few dollars a day, and that really stuck in the maw. This kind of elite international class of people in Mexico who have nothing to do with Mexico, really. They have apartments in Miami. They have apartments in Madrid. They send their kids to Ivy League schools. They're embarrassed about being Mexican, right? They, pretend to be somewhere else. And this was the elite that ran the show here. Arguably, there hasn't been even a center-left president here for decades. You could even argue going back to the 30s with Lázaro Cárdenas, who expropriated the oil industry. And this elite class, which became immensely rich off of the privatizations of the 80s and 90s. I mean, basically, they sold off a large part of the Mexican state, the airlines, the telephones, almost anything you can think of was sold off in one way or another. And this was sold off to cronies who then became very rich. For example, Carlos Slim, who was at the time the richest person in the world, who has control of the phone system here. Then by the 2000s, this had become an open kleptocracy. It had become just a criminal state. Combined with the war on drugs launched by Felipe Calderón, war on drugs after 2006, you had an open kleptocracy and a state of indescribable violence that, hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost. And to the point where you can hardly find a former governor from the PRI who's not in jail, on the lam, or in exile somewhere hiding from the law. That's the extent to which the kleptocracy had eroded the state from within. in combination with, narco elements and such. So AMLO takes power also in very trying circumstances, right? In 2018, with a state that had been so corroded that, it had been, on one hand, there's the state capture, where every single state decision was in the interest of some private interest or other. And then a state terror where this war on drugs was, tearing apart the fabric of the nation. So I think some of these analyses leave out what the starting point here was, too, coming in. Right. It's not like, Mexico was this perfectly operating state beforehand. The Congress, to pass the neoliberal reforms of the 2010s, were openly bribed. The members of Congress were bribed to pass the privatization of the oil industry with money from Odebrecht. They got what's called moches. In order to pass a series of neoliberal reforms, they distributed money. That's it. They bought votes in the election, and they also bought the votes of Congress. This was the panorama we were looking at before now. So whatever criticisms we have of Morena, and they're more than legitimate, let's remember where we were beforehand. Let's be socialists and do a historical analysis, and not just think that this whole situation just started in 2018, right? Just plopped down from the sky. I think that's important.
Yeah, so I want to get into some of those legitimate criticisms, but first, since you mentioned the backdrop of the level of violence that that existed in 2018, I mean, what's the progress on that front look like? Because of some of the reforms that you mentioned in terms of drug laws and the DEA and all of that stuff. I mean, how much has that helped?
It's still one of the most difficult points for Morena and what's called the fourth transformation. AMLO's big constitutional reform was to set up a new militarized National Guard, like a militarized police, which also has some policing functions. And that's worrying.
Right.
That's worrying because it's basically militarizing police functions. And not only that, the military has acquired a lot of power under AMLO's administration. He has leaned on the military a great deal and has also ceded a lot of construction projects to the military. So the military is in charge of building this new airport in Mexico City. It's going to be in charge of running the new Maya train. So it's not only become a military that is out there supposedly protecting national interests, it's also a military that's got involved in construction projects. Right? It also controls the ports and the customs system. The idea is that this is going to be temporary. It's a 5-year reform, and then the military, these functions will be rolled back and the military will be returned to its garrisons. The problem is once you get the military, the genie out of the bottle with Calderon's, ridiculous, stupid war on drugs starting to, it's always very difficult to get it back in, right? And AMLO has increased the power of the military in that sense. Now, not to justify that, but trying to understand why AMLO's done what it's done. Does he love the military? Is he at heart, a secret, military dictator? No. What happened was the federal and state police were totally corrupted by cartels and other interests over the years. So you get to the point where you couldn't trust the state police, you couldn't trust the federal police at all. So AMLO kind of looked at the panorama, was like, well, how am I going to do this? And chose the army, which he contends is a Republican institution, Republican in a small r, as in its history doesn't go back to the 19th century kind of gendarmes, but is a revolutionary. It's outgrowth of the Mexican Revolution in the 20th century, and said, this is my baby. I'm going with this because we can't trust other forces of order. And actually, we saw that in play during the midterms, where there were attempts to buy votes. There's always these attempts to buy votes and coerce votes, and I'll pay you money, but you give me your voter card so that you can't vote, and all these things. And a lot of times you'd see that the police would be complicit in these operations. And so what AMLO did was send out the National Guard to, round the streets during, the midterm elections, and they stopped a lot of these things from going on. Citizens reported these things to the National Guard. In other circumstances, they never would have been punished. They would have said, yeah, nothing would have happened. And in this case, you saw a number of cases where the National Guard stepped in and stopped some of these things from happening. So it's a complicated situation, and it's not great, but that's where it is, and that's a part of an idea of why he's done what he's done without condoning or supporting a militarization in any way.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, military being involved in police functions is, at best very worrying. But I guess so. Yeah, I mean, if it's happening against this, against this backdrop where you have, you have the other, police forces you were saying, have been not only very corrupt, and maybe bed with cartels in some cases, then it's yeah. I mean, you can see how it's a no, it's it's a situation maybe without good options, but like the real concern would be like, okay, but like, how seriously do we take the idea that in 5 years all this is being rolled back?
I think it's probably unlikely.
Yeah.
I think it would take a much larger paradigm shift than maybe the AMLO administration is willing to do. Marijuana has been legalized just recently. I think that'll be a step, but I think it would have to be a much larger legalization effort, across the board, more of a Portugal model. And I think that would be something that, I hope Morena comes to that.
Yeah.
I think it have to be, we're gonna do a radical thing here, and we're gonna legalize across the board. But imagine the U.S. response to that. Imagine the American response to that. As you said, the guerrilla is at the border, so their margin for maneuver in these areas, in particular in the drug area, drugs and migration. Right. Sometimes the United States just doesn't look or doesn't care or whatever about things, but these are the things that they, are constantly looking at from their point of view. Right. So it would be a hard thing. Now, another aspect of this is that AMLO, at the same time, as he's trying to pacify the country, is also unraveling this corruption scandal, which I wrote is on the scale of, Manipolite in Italy or Lava Jato in Brazil. That's the extent to which the corruption had penetrated the state. So you see here a number of prosecutions going on. You see people finally starting to go to trial. It's a slow process. It's not going as fast as we'd like. At the beginning of August, Mexico is going to vote in a referendum as to whether they want their former presidents to be able to be put on trial for their corruption. And that's very likely to win. I can't see that it's going to lose. So then you set up a situation where probably Peña Nieto and Felipe Calderón might very well be seeing themselves put on trial, right? And which is, that is a big deal. It's a very big deal to, I think every time you have even a center left, a social democratic government that comes in on the heels of massive corruption, what do you do? How far can you go without the extreme right forces, allying with foreign interests to try to bring it down? Right. And if you're going after, the big wigs of prior administrations, do you set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Do you just say, oh, bygones are bygones? Do you do like Obama and go to the bankers and say, I'm your wall of defense against the people? How do you handle that?
Or be like Obama and say, we're going to look forward, not backwards. So CIA torturers aren't going to be prosecuted, etc.
And in this case, under incredible public pressure, because AMLO at first is like kind of adopted a very similar look forward, not backward kind of thing. Vengeance is not my forte, he'd said. But the extent of corruption was such that the public pressure is overwhelming, that people go on trial, that there are trials here, that that somebody finally pays for everything that the Mexican public had to suffer through. We're talking about a public that suffered through, the massive devaluation of 1982, then almost the wholesale privatization of their state, then another massive devaluation in 1994, which took more zeros off their currency, then a kleptocracy, which eroded the state from within, right? Then kind of this elite strata of governance, which did absolutely whatever they wanted. Governors would just take public funds and divert them through shell companies, through phantom companies into campaigns. So you'd have millions of dollars of state money, public money from the states and from the federal government being diverted into election campaigns, being diverted into people's coffers. There's a governor now, Francisco Garcia Cabeza de Vaca from Tamaulipas. They're just about to strip him of his political immunity. He racked up like some 40 properties, luxury ranches, menageries with exotic animals. It's like a Garcia Marquez novel times 10. It's almost impossible to describe the level of corruption that this elite strata of Mexican society had gotten involved in. And most of the time, with the United States saying, oh, this is great. Have some more arms through the Merida plan, right? Or let's run in, more weapons through Fast and Furious. Or, we know that people in the Calderon government were kind of colluding with the Sinaloa cartel, but hey, we had to do business with them because these governments were doing what the United States wanted and privatizing large parts of the state. So it's a large, going back to, again, why he's leaned on the military. It's a large project to go against, not only a scene of drug violence, but also an elite, corrupt elite, which, as we saw in this midterms, ganged up against Morena. All the major parties ganged up against Morena and still couldn't win. So that I think was heartening from our point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to, I want to talk about what the sort of, you mentioned a few times that there are many, legitimate criticisms of Morena's record, and we touched on a couple of those areas already.
Sure.
But, I think, sometimes I think even, kind of left liberal American commentators, it's a very superficial critique. It's like it's some of it seems to have to do with AMLO's personality. He reminds them too much of Trump or something. But there's also there are they're the stupid criticisms, But there are real disappointments, from a left perspective.
Yeah. I think one of them has been AMLO's economic straitjacket in some areas. I'd recommend Tony Wood wrote a very good article about this in the New Left Review, if anybody'd like to take a look at that, about AMLO's austerity policy and also kind of why he's been doing that, and touched on some of the points that we touched on here. Even so, with that economic straitjacket, he's still managed to do a lot of the things that we've mentioned. I think one of the disappointments is he's just come out again and reiterated that he's not going to raise taxes. And the wealthy here, like in the States, but even more so, don't pay taxes. All kinds of loopholes, all kinds of things. So you get corporations which pay a very low rate of tax. You have the wealthy which pay a very low rate of tax. You have billionaires who have gotten much richer during the pandemic, and AMLO again has ruled out the major tax reform that Mexico needs. Landlords don't pay income tax here, which they should be doing. There's all kinds of loopholes for the wealthy in the tax system, and it seems like AMLO is ruling that out, which is a disappointment, because there are elements of Morena that want to see that tax reform happen. And I hope that pressure comes from the party in that something moves in that respect. That's one area. Another area has been migration. I think he's made some unpleasant compromises, first with the Trump administration and then with the Biden administration on that. Migrants going through Mexico have to go through a cavalry, which is almost indescribable, what Central American migrants go through passing through Mexico to get to the United States. Abductions, kidnappings, rape, almost no one gets through that unscathed, even before getting to the United States border. And then to kind of play into the U.S. hands of letting asylum seekers, the U.S. dump asylum seekers back into Mexico while awaiting their trials. That's not defendable. That has to change. I think AMLO's response to some social issues, he's not taken the lead on social issues. The state of Oaxaca, where I'm reporting from, legalized abortion with Morena majority legislature in 2019. That was a very pleasant surprise. But AMLO has not taken that up, and Morena has not taken that up at the federal level. And even other states governed by Morena have actively shot down similar initiatives. So that just shows kind of how modeled the party is in some of these things. He's been very insensitive in the issue of feminicides, of killings of women, which is epidemic in Mexico, domestic violence, which has gotten worse during the pandemic. It's one thing for him not to have this as a priority of government, although it should be, but he seems to actively just not understand the gravity of that situation, and that's been a weak point there too. So there's been areas where I think we see this with other leaders as well. Pedro Castillo, who's just elected in Peru, he doesn't have social views that are concordant with what leftists in some of the first world might want. But I think we have to kind of again try to see the overall panorama on some of these things, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially because, like you said earlier, when we were talking about the domestic achievements, you have to start from what's the starting point, what's the realistic alternative. So
right.
it's if there was, it's certainly not as if like the previous government was making a big push to legalize abortion.
Right. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do want to talk a little bit more about how the midterms actually played out, because something you say in the article is that even though, as we were saying at the beginning of the interview, even though there were significant gains in some regions, they showed that they're able to win in like a really on a really national scale,
right.
in both the north and the south of the country. There were significant, like there were some real losses in actually what was their heartland in Mexico City.
Yes, that's right, and that's I put in the article that's a shot across the bow for the party. Now it's interesting if you look at the history of Latin American leaders. It's actually not that uncommon for left leaders to lose their capital cities. Correa lost Quito, I think, a few years into his administration. I think Dilma Rousseff lost Sao Paulo a few years into her administration. On one hand, it's hard to have a balance between a popular government, which is trying to help popular classes, while keeping these very fickle middle classes on board. We know how fickle the middle class is, and they may vote for you today, but then they'll turn against you tomorrow. We know the history of the bourgeoisie in that sense. So that is always a delicate balancing act, I think, in general. But Morena, I think there's an element here. The center left has governed Mexico City, which is, it's enormous. It's the third biggest city in the world since 1997. And so there was a degree of, kind of coasting in that sense. In some of these delegations that they lost, infighting in the parties, some very poor candidates, taking things for granted in what they considered they'd never lose. They never expected to lose Mexico City. They never expected to lose anything in Mexico City, especially how well they did in the rest of the country. They didn't see it coming, and the polls didn't even call it in Mexico City. The polls said there were some tight races here, but never thought that they would lose some of these delegations. And the other point here is the tragedy of the elevated, the overpass, the Line 12 subway disaster in early May, which the right wing, very like vultures, tried to capitalize on as a campaign issue, trying to get a protest vote against Morena nationally, which didn't happen. But I think voters very carefully made a very specific, targeted protest vote to Morena at the municipal level. I mean, Mexico City is a state. It did what DC wants to do. Mexico City has become a state with its own state constitution. So they've really targeted, I think, that protest vote there. That's something that Morena has to be very, very careful about, because it shows all of the weaknesses of Morena in a nutshell. Infighting. There was a terrible fight for the party presidency between Porfirio Montes Ledo and Álvaro Delgado. Just awful infighting before the campaign. Some poor candidates, some just tone deaf kind of stuff. And if Morena doesn't get its act together, two of its leading presidential contenders for 2024 are former mayors of Mexico City. Marcelo Ebrard, who's now the chancellor, the minister of foreign relations, he built this line 12. So, we're going to see where this investigation goes, but Ebrard has got a lot of questions to answer, as well as the construction companies and Carlos Slim and, the German certifiers who came in and said line 12 is great. So, between politicians, construction companies, and international certification organizations, there are a lot of people who've got a lot of questions to answer about this. And the other leading contender is Claudia Sheinbaum, who is the current mayor of Mexico City. And so even now, the jockeying has started for who's going to be the presidential candidate for Morena. And in the shadow of what happened in Mexico City, even though the party did extremely well elsewhere, it better be very careful. It better be very careful because, what's given can be very quickly taken away.
Yeah. You mentioned that the distinction between like how they did in different parts of Mexico City was pretty stark. We've got some, we'll go. There's some, you mentioned that there are all these memes kind of calling attention to this.
Yeah. Before, Morena governed practically all of Mexico City. It governed most of the delegations. So what you saw in this election was that it lost a number of the delegations or alcaldías in the west of the city, which is the areas in blue, and then held the more working class areas to the right, to the east of Mexico City, like Ixtapalapa and others, especially in the southeast. So there were some kind of humorous comparisons being made that we have, instead of the Berlin Wall, it's the Peje Wall. Peje is a nickname for López Obrador, and that Mexico City has become like a Berlin during the Cold War between the West and East. Now, I think that analysis is, we have to remember that in Mexico City, as in the rest of the country, the PRI and the PAN and the PRD ganged up against Morena. Now, in the rest of the country, that didn't work. But I think that combination of right-wing alliance, accumulating votes did work in Mexico City, especially in these more affluent western suburbs. But Morena's going to have to deal with that because I think that right-wing alliance is going to happen again in 2024, almost certainly. This all against alliance. So, they've shown that they can win. I think the good thing is, they won. Mexico City aside, they won in Baja California. They won in Sonora, these big northern-facing, U.S.-facing states. But they also won in the center. They won in Michoacán. They won in Zacatecas. They also won in the south. They won in Campeche. They swept legislatures in Oaxaca and Chiapas. So that's positive. But, AMLO is the big charismatic figure for Morena. Now, they've managed to win without AMLO at the top of the ticket this time, but he's still president. Are they going to manage to have, and this is a classic dilemma, what do they do when your charismatic leader retires in 2024? What does the party do? And absent a mechanism, a genuine mechanism of party democracy, which I mean open primaries and getting the general public involved in governance and becoming a movement again, because it was a movement before. In all these years of fighting electoral frauds, and they tried to keep AMLO off the ballot in his first election, there was this real sense of, these citizens' brigades and it being a popular movement. So now it's the bureaucracy of a party, in power, receiving public financing, with people on the payroll, fighting themselves for candidacies. Is it going to be able to maintain any kind of sense of a movement? Because otherwise it's going to become ossified and go the way of the PRI. I don't want that to happen. I don't think it's gonna happen overnight. But it's a danger. And I think it's good that maybe that they lost a few delegations in Mexico City. Because first, it'll show that the right-wing alliance is going to have to try to govern amongst themselves, which is going to be very fractious. And it'll give Morena a chance to not rest on its laurels and say, it's going to have to deliver in the second half of its, AMLO's term, when most of the time the tendency is to, most of the major reforms are in the first half of the administration, and the second half, you're already looking forward to the next administration, right? It can't afford to do that. It's got a lot more to do. It's got to do banking reform, this cartel of banks. It's got to do mining reform, these mining companies, which, wreak havoc here. It's got to help renters who weren't helped out during the pandemic. Tax reform. It's got to do, it should legalize abortion. It should really take women's rights seriously. It hasn't yet. A very serious climate change proposal. What it did do is it's starting to take public control of the energy grid again, against very stiff international opposition. That was an important first step. Now it has to set out a climate change plan that is at the level of what's needed. It's got to continue the prosecutions, and it's got all of that going on. So it's got a lot more to do, and it can't. It has no center-left governments anywhere. We have no margin for error. The right wing can make screw up all of they want because they've got the press backing, millionaire backing, billionaire backing. Center-left governments, and especially center-left governments in Latin America, have no margin for error. No margin for error whatsoever. And you see this with the way AMLO has been treated by the press, both domestically and internationally. It's kind of I think of it as kind of a sense of what we would have been facing had Bernie won in the States, but even more so because of the international press just dumping on AMLO in tandem with the national press constantly. So AMLO, his big way of fighting back has been daily press conferences, 2 hours at a time, where he fights back against these things and calls out, media lies, and, has got a screen here and projects articles. And he's become like a one-man media criticism show. Because I think that's always a thing. How do I just take all these media lies lying down? Do you delegate this to your press officer? In this case, AMLO has taken this on himself and has kind of become the lightning rod for a lot of things through his daily press conferences. And he's very good at it. It's like a daily show. People watch the Mañanera, his daily press conference, every day. They watch it online. They send out summaries of the press conference in WhatsApp groups and all kinds of other things. So it's a big way of setting the agenda, which I think is an important lesson, I think, for any center-left movement. But it's AMLO doing it. It's not, the rest of the party articulating a structure that's sufficient to push back enough. And I think that's what it needs to do now.
Fair enough. Well, I think it is, I think as we close up, it is really worth taking a step back and saying that, even if there are all these problems, even if they can't rest on their laurels, bottom line, Morena has done what, the NDP in Canada certainly hasn't done, what the Bernie wing of the Democratic Party of the United States certainly hasn't done, and actually took power, implemented, big chunks of its platform, and so far retained power.
That's right. And I think, I think the tendency on the left, and it's certainly understandable with whatever, whatever the left always goes through, is to always see the negative in things, which we have to do. We have to be constantly critiquing. But let's sometimes accept when victories happen. Let's accept some victories and celebrate victories too, because we need victories. The extreme right is on the march across the world. It's on the march in Europe. It's on the march in the U.S. And it's nice to see, because what we want to do is win. We want to win. We want to hold power. We want to do things. We don't want to be in a state of defeat and opposition. So let's get in there with a government like Morena, with what it's had against it nationally and internationally, and with the United States on the border, and the corruption issue and the drug issue, and it's all the history behind it. Let's celebrate what we've got, and then go from there. I think we need to celebrate victories sometimes too. Yep,
that is a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Kurt.
Thanks, Ben, for having me.